Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Otto Von Bismarck Part 3, Iron and Blood by Extra History. Last time we saw Bismarck rise to prominence during the revolutions of 1848, and we saw the issue of German unification emerge as a full-force political problem. Today we will see the continuation of Bismarck's career, especially in the field of international affairs. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
As Bismarck moved from radical to pragmatic, he was at last offered a position in which he would shine. The position of envoy, diplomat, and deal-maker.
Yes, we get to look at Bismarck's international affairs bona fides today.
Bismarck's tutelage in the diplomatic craft was swift. As he wrote to his wife, "I am making rapid progress in the art of using many words to say nothing at all."
Isn't that just politics in a nutshell, huh? Well, seriously though, that is a skill that is apparently very necessary in politics, especially the sort of deal-making that Bismarck will be involved in. And I'm not sure how this series is going to break down Bismarck's career. You know, a lot of times people focus far more on the international side of his career, the deal-making, the diplomacy, the war-making, but there is some really fascinating domestic stuff as well. I don't know how exactly they're going to cover that. I mean, there's a lot to cover in a pretty short period of time, but today, I reckon we'll be looking more at the diplomatic side of Bismarck's career.
He wrote this from Frankfurt. He had been assigned as the Prussian envoy to the Diet of the German Confederation, that being the body that was supposed to figure out how the whole mess of 39 German states were to work together.
Yes, this body that's sort of ad hoc been put together as some sort of replacement for the Holy Roman Empire. If you guys remember, I mentioned last time the Holy Roman Empire had fallen during the Napoleonic Wars, and so the German states had been sort of deciding what to do with themselves. There had been an attempt at unification into a single German state during 1848 that had failed, and so we returned to this sort of weakened confederation where they're all trying to work together, but it's a bit of an awkward arrangement. They're still trying to work out, okay, what is the permanent long-term solution to all of these different German states?
But working with the Austrians was the furthest thing from Bismarck's mind. He was there to assert that Prussia was Austria's equal.
Yep.
And he did this with aplomb by lighting a cigar. See, smoking in the assembly was a privilege granted only to Austrians. But when the Austrian representative sitting next to him took out a cigar and began to smoke,
yes,
Bismarck cracked out one of his own and, saying nothing, lit up.
Yes, and I believe this was not the only such stunt that Bismarck pulled, but it was the most famous stunt. And as they put it, what Bismarck is trying to do is make the point that Prussia is equal to Austria. They are on a level playing field, because if we remember, Austria was by far the more established power. It had a long history of not only power, but of diplomatic international power, especially in this region. Prussia, on the other hand, was still a bit of an upstart. You know, it had been growing in power basically since the late 16 and 1700s, so it had been established as a regional power for a while, but, you know, it was still sort of seen as the little brother in this equation to Austria, the big, storied power of the region. And so Bismarck is trying to show, we are the little brother to no one, we are equal to Austria.
The press loved it. His enemies loved it too. When he returned to Berlin, one of them claimed publicly that the only thing Bismarck actually accomplished in Frankfurt was burning a cigar.
Yeah, and you know, that sort of stunt, I think it is a good way to make a point. I mean, look, we're talking about politics here. Appearance matters. These sort of stunts can get people's attention, but if you do something like that and then nothing actually gets achieved, you do open yourself up to a significant amount of criticism that, well, you're not actually accomplishing anything, you're just posturing on the international stage.
And, of course, because old habits die hard, one thing led to another, and the ever-diplomatic Bismarck found himself once again on the field of honor, trading shots with a fellow Prussian over a cigar burnt to snub the Habsburgs.
Yep.
But his time in Frankfurt taught him one thing. If the Prussians were ever to carry the same weight amongst the German states as their much larger rival, they would need allies. So he began to court what he saw as...
Yes. And that is what Austria had always been great at. If we take a look at the history of Austria, or more accurately of the Habsburg dynasty, we say Austria, but in reality we're talking about the Habsburg Empire. What they had really excelled at was not necessarily making war, though they had done that plenty of times, but what they had excelled at was diplomacy, making allies, forming alliances, securing these important marriages that tied a bunch of other states, a bunch of other dynasties into their own family, therefore bringing that territory into the Habsburg Empire. That is what the Austrians had really been fantastic at. Now, if you look at the history of Prussia, at this point, Prussia's relatively short history of being a sort of major power, it had really risen to the top. Yes, through international diplomacy, but through warfare. They had made a lot of war to cement their position. And so now Bismarck is trying to turn in the other direction. All right, we know we can make war. We're good at that. Let's try and make some allies. Let's try and establish that sort of diplomatic power that Austria has held for a long time.
The two most valuable possible confederates for Prussia, Russia and France. But then, in October of...
Absolutely the two most valuable confederates, if you think sort of geographically, they're straddling both sides of Europe, both big threats to Austria. So, absolutely, but this was not necessarily a popular idea amongst some of the conservatives of Bismarck's time. They did not necessarily like the idea of allying with France, who they saw as liberal, chaotic, unreliable, sort of a natural enemy to Germans or Prussians in this instance. But, as we talked about, Bismarck is becoming more pragmatic as he's dealing with international politics. And so to him, it's not about seeing France as an enemy or an adversary or harboring some disdain towards them. It's about, well, they're in a good position to ally with us, and we can take the fight to Austria. Now, keep in mind, this is all pragmatic for Bismarck. So if Bismarck feels it's pragmatic to make an alliance, he'll do it. If he feels it's pragmatic to break that alliance, a little bit of foreshadowing for the future, he'll do that too. He does whatever he thinks is best for Prussia and later on Germany.
Of 1857, the King of Prussia suffered a stroke. The king's brother, named Wilhelm, because of course he was, why should a family have to come up with more than one name, took over the leadership. This Wilhelm, though, considered Bismarck as nothing more than a petulant schoolboy. His words. Bismarck had a plan, though. Bismarck always has a plan. He would counter this opinion in a most un-Bismarckian, and therefore most Bismarckian, way. He delivered to the prince a 92-page treatise detailing exactly how Prussia could abide by the letter of the agreement they'd signed that founded the German Confederation, while simultaneously aligning the other German states against Austria. Unfortunately, Wilhelm thought that was stupid. Bismarck was promptly assigned as the Prussian envoy to the Tsar. Because, I guess if you want to get rid of somebody in 18th century Europe, you just put him in St. Petersburg.
Yeah, that's how you know you're in the bad books of the court. Someone's got it out for you if you find yourself on a diplomatic posting to Russia. And that really is true. Not all the time, but honestly, if you were in trouble with the court or you'd fallen out of favor, yeah, you really might find yourself shipped off to Russia to serve some sort of diplomatic posting.
Or better yet, Moscow. And there he would sit on ice until 1862.
Yeah.
These were some of the bleakest years of his life. He was cut out of state affairs, he fell ill, he nearly lost the use of his leg, and even withdrew himself from Russian society as his ability to serve as a diplomat was hindered by the fact that everybody knew he was there because his sovereign didn't want him in Prussia.
Damn.
But, at last, a strange letter...
And Bismarck did, of course, keep up to a certain extent with the affairs of the Prussian government and Prussian politics. he wasn't completely detached, but yeah, he did sort of fall away a little bit. He had a pretty bad time, and as I'm sure you can understand, especially with the communication of this era, if you're physically distanced from the Prussian court, it's really hard to actually keep up with whatever's going on. But he's about to find himself a new opportunity in the mail.
Kane, one saying that he should return to Berlin with haste. When he got there, against all odds, he was asked to serve as the head of government. You might reasonably ask, why?
Yeah.
Why would the king who had so long snubbed him ask him to run the state? How could he go from a remote diplomatic posting to the head of domestic affairs? Well, because nobody else wanted the job. At least, nobody else the king thought wouldn't plunge the country into civil war. You see, for a year, the Liberal Party had refused to grant funds for the army. And if you know anything about Prussia, you know Voltaire's old adage. Where some states have an army, the Prussian army has a state.
Yes, this is a very famous Voltaire quote. People love to whip it out when it relates to Prussia, but it's an absolutely fair quote to bring up. I think perhaps more accurate of an earlier Prussia, but it still accurately makes the point that the military was extremely important to Prussian society, and Prussian society was very militarized. I mean, if you're a young man in Prussia, really one of the best ways to work your way up was to join the military. If you wanted to have a position of privilege, it would be a military position. A lot of the nobility, well, they would serve in the military in some capacity. Really, a lot of aspects of Prussian society, life, and politics were tied up with the military. Now, I think it was, like I said, a little less extreme than it was, say, 100 years ago, when Prussia was really militarizing in order to expand its position on the world stage, but Prussia was still very militarized at this point.
Meaning that not funding the army had brought them to the brink of constitutional crisis, and the king's closest advisor's best suggestion was to have the army overthrow the Democratic Assembly and then figure it out from there.
Yeah.
Which was basically 100% guaranteed to start a civil war. So the king figured, call in Bismarck, I guess.
It's funny because we almost see a return to the position that Bismarck used to have when he was younger. If we remember, young Bismarck, he was the kind of guy who, the conservative elites, they didn't really want to have around, but if a job needed done, they would call him in. At this point in his career, he's been sent off to Russia. He doesn't have much going for him. He's fallen out of favor with the court, but at this point, the king really has no one else to turn to. He needs someone who's capable to do the job, but no one who he feels is capable is willing to take the job. And so he says, okay, I guess we have to turn to Bismarck. It really shows you how sort of talented a politician Bismarck was, that even in a situation like this, the king couldn't help but turn back to him.
If he succeeds, fabulous. If he fails, then we'll just throw him under the anachronistic bus. As the announcement went out, no one in the wider world of Europe really thought he had a chance. Neither did many in Prussia. For 2 weeks, Bismarck had to scramble to pull...
And I will say, you might be asking, okay, so why did King Wilhelm not like Bismarck? They didn't cover that very much. Of course, you can have differences in character and just personal dislike, but one of the things the king didn't like about Bismarck was sort of all the power that Bismarck would seize in order to do the job. Bismarck was someone who liked to have control of the situation. As I'm sure you can tell, he's someone who would really assert himself, and that made the king a little bit uncomfortable. So at least that was one of the, I'm sure, multiple reasons why the king, rather wouldn't have Bismarck around, but now he's basically been left with no choice.
Pull together a cabinet, because nobody thought his government would last. Simultaneously, he also had to bolster the spirit of the king, who, in his dejection, was continuously on the brink of giving in. And in the midst of all of this, almost as an offhand remark to those who were debating funding the army, he said the words that would define him and define the age. The great questions of the day will be...
His famous Blood and Iron, or Iron and Blood speech. Here we go.
Decided not by speeches and majority votes, that was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood.
Yes.
But in the midst of...
Yes. This is by far the most famous quotation from Bismarck. It is Iron and Blood, but it's become known as the Blood and Iron speech. It's sort of taken on a life of its own, but I'm going to talk about it specifically as it relates to Bismarck. This is something that will really characterize his actions for the rest of his career. And, he references the revolutions of 1848, if you guys specifically remember. And they didn't really cover it much in this series because there's a whole lot to cover, but one of the issues with 1848 that people really like to point out, there were several issues. I talked about sort of the disjointed nature of the revolutionaries, but one of the issues people saw was that a lot of these sort of middle-class, elite, liberal revolutionaries were not willing to take action. They just wanted to draft legislation and new constitutions all day. And so the Frankfurt Parliament, referenced in 1848, was often called the Parliament of Professors, which was meant to be a sort of derogatory name indicating that they didn't actually get anything done. They just sat around all day debating, giving speeches, and writing things. And this was seen as one of the big issues of 1848. And so Bismarck is saying, and it's sort of funny he's referencing 1848 in this way because, he was completely opposed to the 1848 revolutions. But he's saying, where they failed, I can succeed. And the difference is, we need to use blood and iron. That's what's going to move things forward. War, basically, in a single word. Not giving speeches, not debating. We have to actually get things done. And like I said, that really will characterize his actions throughout the remainder of his career, though Bismarck certainly did plenty of giving speeches and debating, and that will play an important role in his career as well.
All the chaos, Bismarck had a plan. Bismarck always has a plan. If he couldn't get to the Landtag to do what he wanted, well, then he would just have to do what he wanted anyway.
Yep.
You see, the king and the parliament were supposed to agree...
Look, no institution ever got in the way of Bismarck doing whatever Bismarck wanted to do. He would find a workaround
on any new budget before the government could collect taxes on that budget and do with them whatever they wanted. Everyone else took this to mean that the government could not collect taxes without Parliament's approval. But Bismarck had other ideas. See, the Constitution didn't really spell out exactly what the government was supposed to do if the king and the Parliament couldn't agree on a budget. So Bismarck just said, well, we don't have a new budget. Guess we have to keep collecting taxes based on last year's budget.
Right.
And so sent out the king's tax collectors to do what they did best.
That's the sign of a well-designed constitution. Sort of unclear parameters for what exactly should happen in this sort of debacle. Though, to be fair, most constitutions you're going to look at do have a lot of gaps that need to be filled in over time. And that's exactly what Bismarck is doing. He's saying, well, why don't we just sort of work around this?
For nearly half a decade, the government would continue to collect the 1861 budget, and the king would have a stream of revenue without asking Parliament for a thing.
Yeah, and look, now, obviously, this is not an ideal solution to the problem, because you could only collect the same revenue year after year, when surely, as most governments do, you want to increase your revenue collection, but given the situation, it's a damn good impromptu solution, and it will keep the royal government going.
With that settled, Otto now had the prestige and the freedom to turn to what he saw as his larger project, positioning Prussia to be the preeminent power in Germany when the German states finally unified.
Yes.
He moved rapidly. First, he checked in with France to see if they would stay neutral, or perhaps even join Prussia if an armed conflict broke out between them and Austria. Then he wooed the smaller German state.
And Bismarck has really become more enthusiastic about German unification as time has gone on. Earlier on, the last time German unification really had a big spike in interest was 1848. And Bismarck was a lot less enthusiastic at that point. In fact, he opposed not to say he necessarily opposed German unification of any sort, but he opposed the whole 1848 project. And so over time, as he's become more involved in international politics, he begins to become more pro-German unification, and he begins to believe that it must be done on our terms. This is such a rallying cry for liberal contingent of our country, and frankly liberals across the German states, that, myself, Bismarck, sort of representing the status quo conservative faction, well, I should push it forward. We should seize this issue and do it exactly how we want to do it. Once again, we can sort of see how Bismarck separates himself from other conservative figures at the time. A lot of conservatives, they're pro-status quo, they're pro-conservatism. They don't want to move forward on issues like this. They don't want to progress. They want to keep what they have, hold on to the status quo. Bismarck, in a sense, wants to do that, but his method of doing that is changing things up. Seizing on some of these issues, these hot-button political issues, and finding his own way to solve them. He's very pragmatic. He's willing to push things forward. He's not necessarily your usual conservative, but, he does sort of form this archetype of your realpolitik style conservative politician that will become quite influential throughout the rest of this century and beyond. But, yeah, he is quite a fascinating character in many ways.
To begin voting with Prussia, even as he was baffling the Austrians with an alternating volley of threats and lofty promises about how much they could accomplish together. But even as he was holding his own in German affairs, his zeal abroad nearly cost him his ministry.
Oh.
A rebellion had broken out in Poland, and the Russians were eager to quell it, already sending in troops.
Yep.
Bismarck immediately dispatched Prussian divisions to the Polish border and sent a note to Russia basically saying, "Hey guys, we can totally help you with that." Soon, protests over this act.
And this will not be Bismarck's last dealing with the Poles. Absolutely, it will not be his last. Like I said, I'm not sure how much they'll go into, I guess you'd call it sort of domestic policy throughout this series, or how much they'll go into Bismarck's policy on the Poles, but we've got some really interesting and controversial stuff there. But yeah, there's a lot more Bismarck, Polish content to come, I guess.
Action broke out from the other major European powers, with France, Great Britain, and Austria all condemning Berlin.
And yes, sort of Polish independence had been sort of a liberal issue for a while. Poland had a really hard time of it. Poland had been divided between Austria, Russia, and Prussia. It had been partitioned throughout sort of the late 1700s. Then it had sort of a brief resurgence under Napoleon, and supposedly, after the Congress of Vienna, there was supposed to be a sort of semi-autonomous Polish state, but that didn't actually happen. It basically ended up being completely absorbed into the Russian Empire, and so for a while now, Poland has been struggling for its independence, and for a while now, it had been a bit of a sort of popular liberal international issue throughout Europe. I think it had sort of fallen to the wayside at this point because, it had really been decades since Poland had had anything resembling autonomy. But you can still see that a lot of the different countries, both because it was this political issue and also because they were worried about Russia and Prussia grabbing more power, they were not too pleased about this situation.
Many thought that Bismarck would have to resign over this, but the king, the very same one who had exiled him to Russia before, refused his resignation.
Wow.
Soon, Europe's ire turned from Berlin to St. Petersburg, and while the matter would blow over in time, to the Russians, this unification of the European powers against them brought to mind the recent and disastrous Crimean War, and in doing so, reminded them just why having an ally in Prussia might be valuable.
Yes. This is a great point, actually. Russia had recently dealt with the Crimean War, where they'd basically gotten their head knocked in by Britain and France. Russia was feeling kind of down on itself. The Crimean War is often seen as sort of revealing Russian military backwardness, and it certainly was not a good moment for Russia. And so dealing with this Polish uprising, something which Russia believes to be within its own sphere of affairs, they're now getting pushback from, Britain and these other European powers. You can imagine why, after these two events, Russia's starting to say, okay, yeah, maybe we do need another ally. Maybe Prussia would be good. so we can stand up to the Brits and the French and some of the Austrians and these other powers who just want to get in the way of our business.
But just as this affair was being put behind him, his great project was again in jeopardy. The Emperor of Austria had invited the Prussian king to a congress of princes to discuss the matter of German unification. Bismarck at once saw that the Austrians had stacked the deck, and any vote at such a conference would go in their favor.
Yeah, Prussia just did not have the clout, the international influence that they needed quite yet. And to be fair, it's funny, we're talking about Austria's trying to go through with this through, diplomacy and votes. We think back on Bismarck's blood and iron speech when Prussia eventually does unify Germany. Yeah, he's not going to do it by speeches and votes. He's going to use his blood and iron method. But, at this point, who knows which direction it's going to go, right?
But he also knew that he wouldn't be able to convince the king that an invitation from other princes was a trap. So he took a different approach. The king was never the most secure of people, so Bismarck convinced him that the invitation was an insult, and that it should have been sent to him with much more formality.
Nice.
So the king declined to go. But then, days later, the King of Saxony rode up, bearing another invitation imploring the prince to come. Now he had been formally asked to attend by 30 princes with a king as the message bearer. There would be no convincing good old Wilhelm that this was a slight.
Uh-oh.
Instead, in a meeting full of shouting, imploring, and not a little sobbing on both sides, Bismarck convinced...
It does show you the level of influence Bismarck has gained at this point. And clearly Wilhelm appreciates what he does. He refuses resignation. Now, these two men are open enough with each other that they're crying and shouting at each other. We're talking about Bismarck. He's an aristocrat, but a politician and the king of the country.
the king that he would be giving up the independence of the Prussian army if he agreed to anything at this conference. And so, with Bismarck ripping off the door handle on the way out,
literally?
once again, the king declined to attend. With that,
Wow.
the course was set. The initial threats were in check. Now, at last, Bismarck could truly begin his project of iron and blood.
Oh man, alrighty, I'm very excited to get to that. So it looks like we are sort of continuing on with Bismarck in the realm of international affairs, and I'm just curious to see how... I have a sort of sneaking suspicion that we're mainly going to be looking at Bismarck in the realm of international affairs, basically Bismarck's project to expand Prussia and unify Germany. I reckon that's mostly what we'll be focusing on, which is really fascinating. But I do hope we get a chance to talk about the more domestic side of things, because I think what Bismarck did internationally is fascinating and brilliant, but I think equally as interesting is how he handled domestic Prussian and probably more importantly domestic German politics. Really interesting stuff we have to get to, but yeah, this was a fascinating episode. This is just the kind of thing I love. I love the political deal-making, the diplomacy, the international politics, all that sort of stuff. Political history really intrigues me, so I've really been enjoying this series. If you guys have, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon. It is linked down below. Anyway, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.